Norman Lear, the legendary television producer and writer, lived out his final years in Los Angeles. His home was not just a residence, but a museum of American television history filled with scripts, awards, photographs, and memorabilia from shows that shaped the culture of the 20th century. After his passing, the house, a sprawling property nestled in the hills, was sold to a younger couple who admired its history but saw it as a project, a place to renovate and make their own. At first, nothing seemed unusual. They moved in, unpacked, and began adjusting the home's vintage character with more modern touches. But late at night, when the house should have been still, strange things began to happen. The couple reported hearing faint laughter drifting from the den, where Lear once hosted friends and collaborators. It wasn't the bright laughter of joy, it carried an echo, almost like a track from an old sitcom being played in another room. Yet no devices were turned on. One evening, while unpacking boxes in the study, they noticed a script binder lying on the desk. Neither of them had placed it there. Inside was a draft of All in the Family, but words on the pages seemed slightly different, as if rewritten lines hinting at things that had never aired, with notes scribbled in the margins that trailed off into illegible scrawls. The handwriting, they later confirmed after comparing to Lear's old interviews and autographs, matched his own. The strangest moments occurred near the large living room window that overlooked the city. The new owners sometimes found the curtains drawn wide open in the morning, even though they always closed them at night. One night, the wife swore she saw the faint silhouette of a man seated in Lear's favorite chair, lit only by the glow of the city lights below. When she turned on the lamp, the chair was empty but still faintly warm, as if someone had just risen. Neighbors, too, spoke of odd sightings. Some said that lights flickered inside the home long after midnight, even when the couple was away. Others whispered about hearing snippets of dialogue, like an invisible rehearsal happening inside the house. What unnerved the couple most, however, was the recurring sound of applause. Sometimes faint, sometimes loud enough to make them freeze. It seemed to come from nowhere, like an audience responding to moments no one else could see. The house didn't feel hostile, but it also didn't feel empty. It felt like a place where stories lingered, where a man who had spent his life creating characters and laughter had somehow imprinted himself into the very walls. For the new owners, it became impossible to ignore the sense that Norman Lear, though gone, was still writing scenes, this time with them as the cast. The house in the hills carried its weight quietly during the day. Sunlight poured through wide windows, illuminating the memorabilia. Norman Lear had collected across decades, photographs of him shaking hands with presidents, framed posters of shows like Good Times and Maude, a golden Emmy resting on a glass shelf. The couple often moved through the rooms with a sense of reverence, almost as if they were walking inside a living museum. But as the hours bled into twilight, the atmosphere of the house changed. The brightness seemed to drain out of the walls, leaving behind something unsettled, something that pressed inward with silence until the silence itself became unbearable. The first to feel it deeply was the husband. He had been working late in Lear's old office, a space lined with bookshelves heavy with scripts and history books, when he began hearing what sounded like paper shifting. Not just once, but repeatedly, as though someone were leafing through pages deliberately, slowly, pausing as if reading before moving on. He froze, eyes fixed on the desk in front of him. The air felt charged, the way a theater feels before the curtain rises. When he finally forced himself to turn around, the room was empty. But a single script binder had been pulled slightly out of place on the shelf behind him. The wife experienced it differently. She began waking at night to the sound of faint applause, the sort of gentle, rhythmic clapping you'd expect in a studio audience. At first, she thought it was part of a dream, until one night she got out of bed and followed the sound down the hall. It grew clearer as she reached the living room, echoing faintly against the high ceilings. When she switched on the light, the room was perfectly still, yet the old leather chair by the window seemed occupied somehow, its cushions dipped slightly, as if someone invisible had only just risen to greet a standing ovation. Days passed with more subtle disturbances. Lights they hadn't touched flicked on in empty rooms. The smell of tobacco, rich, old, like a cigar that had been left smoldering, lingered in the study, though neither of them smoked. The phone rang once in the middle of the night, the old landline the couple had never used, and when the husband picked it up, there was no voice on the other end, only the hollow buzz of static, punctuated by what might have been laughter, distorted and far away. The neighbors, too, began to notice things. A man across the street mentioned seeing shadows pacing the living room at odd hours, when the couple insisted they were fast asleep. Another neighbor told them she sometimes heard voices carrying down the hillside, snippets of dialogue, comedic banter, almost as though the house itself was running through rehearsals of a show no one else remembered. The couple tried to rationalize it. They told themselves it was an old house with quirks, that they were living among the memories of a man whose entire life was performance. But the unease grew heavier with each passing week. They felt watched not maliciously, but intently, as though Lear himself were still directing scenes, orchestrating beats, waiting for reactions. One evening, during a small gathering of friends, the house made itself known. As the group laughed and talked in the living room, the sound of applause swelled suddenly from nowhere, so loud it drowned out conversation. It lasted only a few seconds, but long enough for every person there to exchange startled looks. When it stopped, the room was thick with silence, and no one dared to speak of it directly. The guests left early that night, unnerved, whispering in hushed tones as they hurried out the door. The couple was left alone with the echo of that applause still ringing in their ears. From then on, they began to feel as if they were no longer just homeowners, they had become part of an ongoing performance. The house was staging scenes, cueing laughter, rehearsing dialogue. And at the center of it all, though unseen, they could sense Norman Lear's presence. The invisible writer, the eternal producer, watching them from the corners of his home. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The house seemed to breathe with its own rhythm, as though the walls remembered the man who had once walked them day after day. The couple began to notice patterns in the disturbances, small details that suggested intention rather than coincidence. At first, it was the timing, always in the evening, always after the sun dipped below the Los Angeles skyline, when the city's hum was distant and muted. The house came alive not in chaos but in cadence, almost as though it were following a script written long before they arrived. One late night, the husband sat alone in the living room, the glow of the city lights spilling through the wide windows. He had left the television off, trying to enjoy the silence, but the silence did not last. A faint murmur began to rise around him, like an audience settling into their seats. He turned his head, straining to hear. It wasn't words, not at first, just a collective presence, a gathering. Then, as suddenly as if someone had pressed a button, laughter erupted. Not booming or cruel, but warm and familiar, rolling through the room in waves. His breath caught in his throat. The sound had no source, no speakers, no recordings, but it carried weight, filling every corner of the space. It was laughter tied not to joy but to memory, as though invisible spectators were watching him, waiting for his reaction. When the sound finally ebbed away, the house felt emptier than before, leaving him shivering in his own home. The wife's experiences grew more intimate, more unsettling in their precision. She often worked at the dining table late into the night, her papers spread in neat piles, her tea cooling at her side. More than once, she returned from the kitchen to find her papers rearranged, not scattered, not disturbed, but organized as though by someone meticulous. On the top of the stack would always be a single page, her own notes, with words circled or underlined in pen that wasn't hers. She would blink at the markings, trying to make sense of them, and though they were often random, sometimes they formed a message. One night, 3 words were underlined heavily: keep it honest. It was something Norman Lear had said in countless interviews about writing. Her hands trembled as she stared at the phrase, the ink still fresh. The most chilling moment came one stormy night in late autumn. Rain lashed against the windows, and the couple sat in the den with a small fire burning, trying to ignore the strange atmosphere the house had cultivated around them. The storm knocked out the power, plunging the house into darkness. They lit candles, their flickering light throwing long shadows across the walls. That was when they heard it, a voice, faint at first, carried under the sound of rain, then clearer, low, measured, almost conversational. It seemed to come from the old armchair by the fireplace, Lear's favorite seat. They couldn't make out every word, but the cadence was unmistakable, a tone filled with the weight of authority, the rhythm of someone used to directing others. They froze, hands clutched tightly together. As the voice carried a single phrase clearly through the room, "Let's run it again," from the top. The fire popped violently then, as though reacting, and the voice was gone. The storm raged on outside, but inside the house, silence settled once more. The couple sat unmoving, both pale, both unwilling to break the quiet, as though any sound they made might summon it again. From that night forward, the house no longer felt simply haunted, it felt inhabited. Doors opened into rooms already filled with unseen energy. Lights flickered not randomly but in rhythm, like cues in a performance. Even their daily lives began to feel scripted, with strange coincidences pushing them into moments that felt rehearsed, as though they were playing roles assigned to them. The wife began to dread looking into mirrors. More than once, she caught glimpses of something over her shoulder, not a figure, not fully, but the outline of someone tall, balding, with glasses, standing just far enough behind her that when she turned, the reflection was gone. The husband, meanwhile, swore that whenever he sat in Lear's old chair, he felt the weight of someone behind him, a hand nearly resting on his shoulder, a presence so close it was impossible to ignore. The house was no longer theirs, not fully. It belonged to the past, to the laughter that had filled it for decades, to the man who had shaped culture from his study and his scripts. And though Norman Lear was gone, the couple began to wonder if he had ever truly left. The house grew heavier with each passing week, as though the air itself absorbed the couple's unease and pressed it back against them. What had once been a dream living inside the former home of a legend was beginning to feel like a role they hadn't auditioned for, one they couldn't quit. They spoke less about it openly, avoiding words like ghost or haunting, but their silence carried weight. Every creak in the floorboards at night was met with wide eyes and held breath, every flicker of the lights with a glance toward the ceiling as if acknowledging something unseen. The husband began to notice how time itself shifted in the house. He would sit down in the study to read for half an hour, only to glance at the clock and realize 2 hours had passed without his awareness. The tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway sometimes echoed louder than it should, filling the air in a steady, commanding beat like the opening rhythm before a show began. One night, while alone in the office, he swore the ticking actually stopped. The silence was so profound it rang in his ears, and then, faintly, came the shuffle of papers behind him. When he turned, the script binders on the shelf had rearranged themselves. The spines now formed a perfect line of titles, each one of Lear's most famous works, as though someone wanted him to notice the order, the legacy. The wife felt the house differently. For her, it was not about time but about intimacy, about the way the walls seemed to listen. She would hum softly while cooking or cleaning, nothing intentional, just a small tune to fill the silence. But the silence was never empty. More than once, she heard her own humming echoed faintly back to her from another room, slightly delayed, slightly altered, like a call and response. It terrified her the first time, but as it continued, she realized it wasn't mocking. It was participatory, as though the house wanted to join her, to be part of whatever she was doing. The nights became the most unbearable. They began to hear footsteps in the hallway after midnight, heavy, deliberate, slow. Not the creaks of wood shifting, but steps that carried weight, crossing from one side of the house to the other. Sometimes the footsteps paused outside their bedroom door, and the silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. They would lie motionless in bed, clutching each other's hands, waiting, praying for it to continue rather than linger outside. When at last the sound moved on, trailing off into the distance, they dared not speak until dawn. One evening, unable to ignore it any longer, they invited a close friend to stay over, someone practical and skeptical, someone who would either reassure them or confirm their fears. The friend laughed off their nervousness at first, joking about haunted houses and Hollywood cliches. But by the second night, the laughter was gone. While the three of them sat in the living room, the old radio on the shelf crackled to life. It hadn't worked since they moved in. Static filled the room, Then a sudden burst of dialogue. Not music, not news, but a snippet of conversation from one of Lear's shows, Archie Bunker's unmistakable voice cutting through the static before fading back into silence. No one spoke. The friend's face went pale, and he excused himself early, refusing to stay another night. The couple was left with the undeniable truth. The house was staging moments for them, creating scenes that felt both deliberate and impossible. The walls were not only holding memories, they were performing them. And they could no longer tell if they were witnesses to these performances, or if they had unwillingly become the stars of Norman Lear's final production. The breaking point came on a night that began like any other. The couple had grown accustomed to living inside a constant atmosphere of tension, but they had not yet admitted to each other that they were reaching their limit. The house had become a stage they could not step off of, and the longer they stayed, the more it felt like Norman Lear's presence was tightening the script around them. That evening, the wife stood in the kitchen preparing dinner while her husband read in the den. The smell of garlic and onions filled the air, normal and comforting, until she realized the radio silence since the last incident was humming again. She walked into the living room and found it turned on, though neither of them had touched it. This time, it wasn't static or a voice she could dismiss as coincidence. It was applause, loud and rolling, swelling through the speakers as though hundreds of unseen people were gathered just beyond the walls. Her heart pounded as she reached to switch it off. The knob would not turn. She yanked the cord from the socket, and still the applause continued, echoing through the room until it suddenly cut off, leaving her trembling in the silence. The husband, rushing in, found her pale and shaking. Before he could speak, a sound rose from the den, footsteps, unmistakable, pacing across the carpet in steady rhythm. They looked at each other, neither wanting to face it but knowing they had to. Together, they stepped back into the den. The air was colder there, unnaturally so. The husband's breath fogged in front of him as though it were a winter night, not a warm California evening. On the old leather chair by the fireplace, the chair Lear had loved most, they saw the cushion sink down, pressed by a weight they could not see. And then, clear and resonant, came a voice, places, everyone. Let's run it again. It was Norman Lear's voice. There was no mistaking the timbre, the measured cadence, the authority of someone who had directed lives through his words. The wife clutched her husband's arm, her nails digging into his skin, as they stared in disbelief. The house responded to that command. Lights flickered overhead, not randomly, but in rhythm, like cues on a soundstage. The grandfather clock in the hall began to tick louder, beating like a metronome. The air vibrated with a low hum, a rising tension, until the sound of laughter filled the room. Applause and laughter, layered together, a full studio audience reacting to nothing they could see. And then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse. The couple turned to leave, but the door slammed shut before they could reach it. They spun back toward the chair. This time, there was no subtle impression, no faint presence. A figure sat there, dim, transparent, but unmistakable. Norman Lear himself, or what remained of him, his outline shimmering as though caught between film and reality. His face was calm, but his eyes held a weight, a determination. He raised one hand, as though directing them, and the husband felt his own body stiffen. Words rose in his throat that were not his own, a line of dialogue he did not recognize, spilling out before he could stop them. The wife gasped as she, too, felt words pressing into her mouth, pushing past her lips in perfect unison with his. They were reciting a scene they had never rehearsed, yet it came out flawlessly, as though the script had been written into their bones. The phantom audience laughed at their lines, clapped at their delivery, responded to beats that made no sense in real life but flowed with eerie precision. When the scene ended, the applause rose again, deafening, shaking the walls of the house. The figure in the chair nodded, satisfied, and slowly faded, leaving only the faint outline of his presence in the cushion. The laughter ebbed away, the applause died, and the silence returned. The couple collapsed into each other's arms, terrified beyond words. They realized then that the house wasn't simply haunted, it was a stage, and they were no longer just residents. They were cast members, bound to perform in a production directed by a man who refused to let go of his life's work, even in death. The next morning, without discussion, they packed what they could carry. They left the house as quickly as possible, abandoning their belongings, their plans, and even their pride. Neighbors saw them drive away pale and shaken, never to return. The house has stood empty ever since. At night, from the street below, some claim they still hear it, the faint echo of laughter rolling out of the windows, applause carried on the wind, and a voice, low and insistent, calling into the darkness. Let's take it again from the top. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.